Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to the WakeCon show where we discuss housing economics and the economic forces that are shaping our communities. We're powered by Professor Lending, which is based in Wake Forest, North Carolina, hence Wake and Econ together. In today's episode, I am very excited to introduce you all to Michael Green, and we're going to be discussing a recent essay of his on the Valley of Death, Why $100,000 is the New Poverty. So I read this recently, and it was incredibly interesting. And so I thought, well, we need to have a discussion on this because I think it's important as we think about sort of the economic factors that are happening in our society today. Michael, before we get started, maybe just give me a little bit of background of who you are and how you got into what you're doing now.
Sure. So I am the chief strategist and senior portfolio manager for a firm called Simplify Asset Management. We're about a $13 billion asset management firm focused on what are called alternative ETFs. Basically, strategies that would have traditionally been captured in hedge funds that are now, due to regulatory changes, able to be expressed in ETFs, which improves both their tax efficiency and the availability for the average investor. In particular, I manage a high yield fund that takes a traditional high yield exposure and tries to hedge credit spread widening or increase risks in the high yield market against it. Um, and I've been in the investment world for give or take 30 years, which gives you some idea that I'm relatively old. But that's just a quick background on it. I think the way you were exposed to me is through my Substack posts about 20 years ago. As part of my process with communication with investors, I started writing. Initially, that took the form of email distributions to my investors. That eventually turned into a relatively well followed email newsletter distribution called the Ice Farm Weekly Update. Um, During the course of my career, I went to work for Peter Thiel, managing his personal capital for a period of time. During that time period, I had to kind of go silent for fairly obvious reasons. And when I was able to go back into the public sphere, I launched a Substack called Yes, I Give a Fig. That is where you would find my writings and thinkings on other markets or economies, political components, etc.
Awesome. So in this essay in particular, I mean, you mentioned how I guess the U.S. poverty line is calculated as just three times the cost of the minimum food diet in 1963. Adjusted for inflation, and you mentioned how this makes you feel sick. So maybe just explain a little bit for why that makes you feel sick and how that is not relevant in our current context.
Um, okay, so the quick component is the background on why it was three times the minimum food budget was an observation by an economist working for the Department of Social Services, where Social Security comes from, Molly Orshansky. She was trying to understand the concept of poverty, how to identify families that would be in crisis. She made the observation that in 1963, roughly 33% or a third of the household budget was spent on food. And so she did a shorthand calculation. She basically said, look, if I take the minimum food budget, the minimum amount of spending that the USDA provides, and that would only be eating at home, it would be cooking your own food, it would be buying flour and baking cakes as compared to buying cake mixes, etc. Three times that level was an absolute minimum threshold that could be established that would say if a family is not meeting this level, that is crisis, right? They can't afford the absolute basic minimum components. As she put it, we can't tell what is too much, right? No human being ever knows what is too much, but we can identify what is too little. Um, Even before it was officially adopted as the official poverty line, so that calculation was then adopted in 1969 as the official poverty line as part of the war on poverty. We began taking the level that was achieved in 1969 by taking three times that USDA minimum food budget and then raising it on a nominal basis by the inflation metric we call CPI. She recognized that changing consumption patterns were creating conditions in which this is really no longer true. And so by 1966, she was already cautioning people that, this doesn't mean the same thing we thought it did, but it was an easy calculation and it made life simple for the government to be able to put this number out there. And it had a very tangible benefit as well, because if you set it at a level that is actually artificially low, it allows you to declare, hey, we're winning the war on poverty because there's fewer and fewer poor people each year. That's why I got sick, because I realized that what was actually happening was a whether intentional or unintentional subterfuge as to what the actual minimum standard of living was in the United States. And the essay was largely the essay and some subsequent writings were largely around the exploration of that experience and what are the implications of it.
Yeah, and I think you argue sort of like the real floor is roughly like 140,000 now. I mean, when you
Well, just to be
for
very, very clear, this was not intended as like an academic white paper. I was not trying to write a
yeah,
PhD thesis or anything else. This is literally like just a weekly exploration, right? So it was me, being somewhat provocative and thoughtful on it. Initially, I did the exploration against a town in New Jersey, Caldwell, New Jersey, that had been featured in a prior post in which I was evaluating the claims that were being made by some people that, the American dream was still achievable. You just had to settle for something less, right? And the town of Caldwell, New Jersey was highlighted. When I did the analysis for Caldwell, New Jersey, that poverty line worked out to about $136,500. That was as of 2023, by the way. That number would be higher today. If I look at the most statistically average city in the United States, which is not all that far from you in Lynchburg, Virginia, Lynchburg, the number works out to about 97,000 as of 2023. It would be over about 102,000 if I adjust it for today. Which is where the subsequent analysis said there's about $100,000. But the really critical thing to the analysis was understanding the implications of that differential between that number and the actual designated poverty line. The reason it matters is because the poverty line, well, it's a somewhat arbitrary designation, at least to an outside uneducated observer. And I candidly would include myself in this category until I began to explore the topic is that, the poverty line is supposed to tell you where you're poor, right? Everybody who's above the poverty line is ostensibly not poor, right? And unfortunately, for policy reasons, that's exactly how we treat it. So if you are near the poverty line or below the poverty line, which again, to emphasize, we're looking at a family of four with two income earners and two children. That creates some very specific conditions. Among other things, you need childcare, right? How do you handle taking care of children if both parents are working? You need to contract for childcare. Some individuals will be able to avoid that if they live near their parents, right? That actually paradoxically creates its own costs. It reduces your mobility, right? You are less likely to leave a region if your parents are willing to help care for your children to obtain better employment prospects elsewhere because the incremental cost of moving outweighs the benefits that you would receive. Something very similar plays out in the way that policy handles the poverty line. Once you begin to exceed that threshold, we start withdrawing benefits that you would receive if you were at that level. Below about $40,000, very near that poverty line number, you are both you're receiving a package of benefits that ironically the government estimates is worth around $54,000, which would put you right at that $94,000 to $97,000 number that I was talking about before. And so again, that's kind of prima facie evidence we know this is not right. But as you exceed that threshold, as you cross that 40,000, they start stripping away those benefits, forcing you to meet those costs with cash income. And so as you move from 40,000 to 50,000, you lose your SNAP benefits, your food subsidies. As you move from 50,000 to 65,000, you start losing shelter benefits and healthcare benefits. By the time you get to 100,000, you've by and large been stripped of almost all benefits. And as a result, on a cash basis, you are actually slightly worse off in many ways at 100,000 than you were at 40,000. That means there's a marginal tax rate on the effort of you raising your income from 40,000 to 100,000 that exceeds 100% and creates conditions that I think many of your listeners are probably aware of or have certainly seen in their peer group, which is people working really, really hard, getting more successful and feeling like there's actually less left at the end of the day. That's what the Valley of Death description was about. That was really what the essay was emphasizing. And the implications of how we should address that from a policy framework are really the source of subsequent explorations.
yeah, and I mean, from the policy standpoint, like, have you thought at all about like what potential solutions could be for this?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest one is actually to adopt policies that Milton Friedman had promulgated in the 1970s, that led to what's called the Earned Income Tax Credit, effectively recognizing that below a certain threshold, even if you are working, you may not be earning enough to be an active participant in society. We want to encourage people to participate. And so the earned income tax credit is a way of basically attaching a negative tax rate to your income that offsets that loss of benefits. My argument is very simply that we should meaningfully expand the earned income tax credit, send more cash in particular to young families that have made that hurdle jump, where they've incurred the significant basket of cost increases associated with getting married, having children, raising young children, et cetera, that's hitting at exactly a time in their lives when they are least resourced. Um, that's the clear policy prescription from it. Now, that engenders pushback in two directions. One, how are you going to afford this? Well, the answer, unfortunately, is that you need to adopt a more progressive tax code. You need to recognize that those who have been extraordinarily fortunate and successful within our society have to pay higher taxes to offset that. Nobody wants to do that. And so there's natural pushback from the right on that framework. The second component is if you frame it as a cash return, well, then you can't build up giant edifices for distributing childcare resources or for distributing food benefits or for distributing housing support in the form of Section 8 housing, et cetera, right? You're destroying the employment base and the political support for the left. And so these are unpopular policies in both directions. I think the left is a little more legitimate, right? Which is that there is a point at which we begin focusing on this and we distract our focus from those who are truly, truly in deep crisis, right? We don't want to actually restrict resources. One of the responses from the right was, well, of course, this is exactly what you would expect. Benefits are distorted. We should get rid of all of them, right? Like, that's just an absurd articulation, and the left is understandably concerned about that potential response from the right. The right is really more like, yeah, I don't want, keep your hands off my money, you grubby people. And that's a little bit less defensible, but they are typically better resourced and slightly more coherent in their claims. And as a result, that tended to be the elevated component of the debate.
Yeah, and I mean, how much is the childcare factor really playing into a lot of this where that's a humongous line item in people's budget now?
Yeah, I mean, this is the really crazy part about it, right? If you do the poverty analysis, it suggests that the poverty level for that family of four with two income earners and two children is about $32,000 in income. Child care alone in the United States for two children is $27,000 on average. So, like, the mismatch is just absurd. Like, we know this is not right. And, I've demonstrated this in 50 different ways, right? Everything ranging from looking at the tuitions of elite private schools relative to the poverty line in the 1960s to the relative cost of cars and everything else. The simple reality is part of the reason that you need to feel sick when you hear the methodology that is used for how to calculate that poverty line, fixing that level at 1969 and projecting it forward to today is that CPI does a terrible job of explaining the costs of being poor. And it's not designed for that. It's designed to capture an average. Um, there's a really perverse impact when you think about the average, right? Rich people are the ones who buy new technologies and new luxuries. When cell phones first came out, the first time many of us saw them was when Michael Douglas was holding one in the movie, Wall Street. He's holding this giant brick. He's standing on a beach in the Hamptons and he's talking to Charlie Sheen, right? The vast majority of people had no idea what a cell phone was, had no intention of putting it into their consumption basket. The price of that cell phone has collapsed. The only people who benefited from that decline in price were actually the rich people who were already buying that phone, right? Or were buying it at various steps along the way and experienced the benefit of that decline in price. Poor people didn't benefit from that, but that decline in price of cell phones has a meaningful negative impact on the CPI calculation that presumes that they do benefit from it. And so perversely, what we actually know, and there is research that has just recently come out in the last year or two that is, candidly not well promulgated and understood because it's politically inconvenient, which is that the cost of living index for people who are near the poverty line or at the lower income levels is dramatically higher than the price increase that is experienced by rich people who benefit from this declining cost of luxuries. Um, it's just a false framing. We're using the wrong tools to do this. It's like trying to build a house exclusively with can openers. You can't do it and it's wrong. And it unfortunately leads to an experience that I think many of your listeners will be familiar with, this concept of gaslighting, where you're being told you should be so happy because things have never been better. And meanwhile, you look at your checking account at the end of every month, assuming you can even afford one, or have access to one. And the reality is it's not growing in its balance. And you're like, man, is it me? Am I the loser? Like, am I the person who is just like not capitalizing on all of this? And the reality is it's not you, it's the system. And I'm saying this as one of the most ardent capitalists you'll ever meet.
So when it comes to like even the housing market, I think you mentioned how like a modest starter home, the floor is like $2,000 a month, right? Does has that the starter home just kind of gone extinct where jobs actually exist?
By and large, yes, right? And so there's a combination of factors that are going on there. One is the cost of the land itself is always going to be a function of population density, right? If you have a million people trying to squeeze into a 5 acre area or a 20 acre area like Manhattan, the prices are going to be a lot higher than if you have five people trying to squeeze into a 20 acre region, right? That's somewhat self-evident. So as population increases in an area, the price of land rises. Perversely, that increased cost of land means that in order for it to be economic to build something, you actually have to build a larger house, because on that higher priced land, you need to earn both a return on the land and the structure. It makes no sense to build $100,000 house on $1 million piece of land. Um, that dramatically lowers your net profit margin when you consider the cost of buying land. So it creates restrictions on those starter homes, reduces the availability of a quantity of properties that would be available to people that are trying to buy that starter home, and perversely pushes the price of those starter homes up at an accelerated rate relative to the overall housing market.
Yeah, I mean, I think of even the area that I'm in here in North Carolina, and from the last, I mean, before COVID to after COVID, a starter house looking at 250 to $300,000 is now averaging $450,000, and I just don't know how a new young family with brand new jobs, can afford something like that and to get into it. It's difficult to find
Well, it's
shelter.
made it's
That's
made even worse than that, though, right? Because as that young family, part of what you're hoping to accomplish is subsidy for your children's education. So you want to be in a nicer area, right? Now, ostensibly, an older person living in that nicer area who no longer sends their children to school, in a purely economic calculation, right? They should sell that house, they should move to a crappy neighborhood, and they should arbitrage that difference because they no longer need access to the schools. But that's not how humans behave. Right? They are locked in at that historical cost. Their cost of servicing their mortgage references the cost of purchasing it, not the current market value of it. It is a tax advantage transaction because it's a levered, non-taxable transaction that raises their value over time. And so they don't do what quote unquote perfectly competitive economic models would suggest that they do. It's not the fault of the people, it's the fault of the economic models.
So when I think, like CPI and these other things aren't really getting at the core of the issue, are there any sort of data fields or points out there that we should be paying more attention to in general to help understand these things?
Okay, so this is a post that I wrote on December 21st called "The Land of Milk and No Honey." Okay, so this is off of my Substack. There's a bunch of stuff on here, some of which, including a fat picture of me, you can laugh at. But the relevant point for this discussion is actually giving a very tangible estimate of this, or an example of this. And so this is where the title of the piece comes from, right? "The Land of Milk and No Honey, we can't afford milk." Imagine that we're actually talking about milk as an aggregate asset, right? Many of your listeners will remember that there was no organic milk when they were children. Some of them will be young enough that there probably was, but there certainly was not for me. Um, the Organic milk as an asset class, or as a consumption basket class, basically emerged in the late 1990s. It was originally priced at a significant premium to what I jokingly refer to as polluted milk, and it had very small market share. As its market share grew and the cost of producing that organic milk relative to the polluted milk fell, the price of organic milk is falling over time while the price of polluted milk is rising over time. The relative market shares of those produces a weighted basket that you can actually see is growing far less rapidly than so this hedonic basket that captures the value associated with paying more for organic milk, which ostensibly comes through in what's called consumer surplus. That hedonic basket grows far less rapidly than the weighted basket, and significantly less rapidly than the cost experience of the poor, which is actually this polluted milk basket. So the CPI, right, milk is give or take 5%, is 4.8%. The poor inflation is 5%. The rich inflation is minus 5%. And as those prices begin to normalize and they flip and it becomes a market share, that actually changes. And we then start to see rapidly increasing prices in CPI, which is what that surge in CPI was. But crazily enough, there's no change in the inflation rate for the poor, right? What this means is that the rich are accruing an increasing surplus on their purchase of milk, and the poor are incurring an increasing deficit on their purchase of milk. Right. This is the experience that people are having where those benefits are inflated at CPI. They're growing far less rapidly than their real costs, driving that poverty line and that benefits line lower and lower relative to their actual, to steal a phrase from recent times, lived experience. Um, this is the wrong tool for the job. This is not how we should be thinking about benefits and providing benefits to people who are genuinely struggling within our society. This is part of the experience that many of your listeners will have where they turn around and they realize they're working much harder and not getting ahead, and then turn and look at somebody who's buying food with an EBT card and food stamps, and that person bizarrely seems to be wealthier than they are. They're not putting food back that they can no longer afford because the government is covering their costs. Unfortunately, this kind of sits at the core of the experience that underpinned that piece. And I just think, increasingly, this is actually really defining our, the lived experience of people between that 40,000 and roughly 140,000, which is the vast majority of American households.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it seems like even in the last election, everybody's rationale was saying like, "Hey, look, um, the cost of eggs and the cost of butter are too high, and I can't afford my groceries anymore." And it seems like there's definitely a common experience where things just feel like they're crushing people more. Are there any states that you're aware of that seem to have a handle on this better than others?
Not really. And so, unfortunately, this is a national program. That poverty benefit is a national metric. Ostensibly that, but by the way, I want to be very clear. Like, I don't think the right answer is give people who live in New York a lot more money and people who live in West Virginia a lot less money. Part of the incentive of the government is actually to somewhat equalize that across regions. And so if cost of living is dramatically lower in West Virginia, we should actually see people relocate to West Virginia. That would actually encourage businesses to then locate in West Virginia, creating jobs and opportunity that theoretically equalizes that. But if you got the numbers totally wrong, it's not going to accomplish that. In fact, all it's going to do is lock people into cycles of poverty.
So, is there any solution at all for just your regular families who feel like they're being crushed in these lower? Or, I mean, is the solution for them to move to a lower cost state? You just mentioned it. If the numbers are wrong, it's going to be
Unfortunately,
a
moving
problem.
to a
So, like,
lower cost
how do
state
they think
often
about it?
Yeah, so unfortunately, moving to a lower cost state often incurs those significant additional, costs, right? Typically, they are living in a relatively high cost area because it allows them access to an extended family network that in many ways helps to defray some of those costs. And so they're drowning in a million ways. At the same time, their parents look at them like they've grown a second head, right? When they say, "Oh my God, can you believe I'm paying 25,000?" They move away, they get a good job, and they turn and say to their parents, "Can you believe I'm paying $30,000 for childcare?" Their parents like, "You're doing what? What's wrong with you? I never paid anything like that. Like, get it together. We didn't need childcare." And meanwhile, the kid is sitting there going, yeah, mom stayed home. You didn't need childcare, right?" And the reality is they're like, "Yeah, but we paid for this expensive college education, and now with that expensive college education, you should be making much more money. You must be a failure." Right? And that literally is the discussion that boomers are having with their children, and the boomers think that they're being generous by like, "Okay, I'll send you a check for $5,000. I'll do this, right? I'll take care of that." And they expect you to be incredibly grateful against it. And the reality is they have no mechanism for understanding the life that you're living. It's a little bit
So, you
trying.
mentioned
Yeah, go ahead.
no, the difference in the generations here. Like, is there any sense in which the boomers really did have it a lot better, and now Gen Z, millennials, and Gen X are missing out on this?
Unfortunately, that is the conclusion. It's not that the boomers were intentionally bad. It's that we had very flawed economic insights that powered much of the last 50 years. And I'll give the simplest example of that. And a lot of my other work is around things like the impact of passive investing, how that changes markets and market structure. Let's just set forth a very simple hypothesis, right? If you are investing passively, so you are simply buying all the publicly traded securities, you you are doing nothing to actually generate those returns. You're simply following the societal average, right? In other words, your returns are purely luck, right? It really is. Like it's totally luck. You have acknowledged there is no skill in my investment process. It is purely luck. Meantime, somebody who works, their return, their income is a byproduct of both their effort and their skill. Right? We actually know that to be true, right? If I'm smarter, if I'm able to do more complex jobs, if I work more hours, I should get compensated more. And yet in our society, we have a much higher tax rate on that effort and skill than we do on the luck. Right? When you do that, that actually perversely creates an economy that concentrates its wealth in what's called a gerontocracy, the old generation, which is experiencing a lower tax rate without the required redistribution, is going to consolidate wealth in that generation. And the younger generation is going to be left struggling and wondering what's wrong with them. It has nothing to do with the effort. It has nothing to do with the skill or discipline that your parents had. It has to do with how we set the incentives and redistribution structures, which is really what tax is in our society. We adopted a flawed methodology in which we asserted that by lowering tax rates on investment, we were going to increase growth. That was true in some ways for the aggregate, but all of that growth was concentrated in capital holders as compared to laborers, which is why the working class is experiencing such frictions today.
That's really interesting. Is there any pushback on maybe changing that at all?
No, because it's perceived in our neo Calvinist society that your financial success is a byproduct of your innate talent. Right? We've convinced ourselves that this is a meritocracy, even though I can recreate these conditions using simulations with zero skill. I can actually load it with negative skill if I provide the type of tax structure that we currently have and achieve the same outcomes. Right now, people will argue, well, that's obviously facile, Mike. There is skill, and I will fully acknowledge that. But here's the scary part, Jordan. If I can accomplish a distribution that looks identical to what we're experiencing in our society with a negative loading for skill, why would I introduce skill into the system? That's actually a complication that I can't easily analyze. It suggests the system is even more, if they're right, it suggests the system is even more unfair to the average participant than I've assumed.
So this is all really interesting and helpful, and I'm just trying to think, for different segments of society, what's their like takeaway with the current situation? Is it like, hey, I need to think about how I can invest and take advantage of these things? Is it, I need to go into public policy and help make changes? What's the solution?
Yeah, so there's a long-standing expression from John Maynard Keynes, which is practical men who fancy themselves exempt are slaves to some defunct economist. We took a terrible left turn with Milton Friedman and the articulation of, capitalism as freedom. Capitalism is simply a mechanism of information exchange. It allows me to use prices and the individual behaviors to convey information about what is valued and what is needed. That in turn encourages investment and supply in areas that are experiencing shortages because they offer extraordinary profit opportunities. The more you move to a system in which you effectively embed the outcomes as a byproduct of whether you are accessing wealth through work and effort or whether you are accessing it through capital, which is really a luck function, particularly as we've specified it through things like passive investing, which I think you'd be very hard pressed to argue against that articulation. Um, the more the system locks us into these outcomes. And so this is like the quick answer is other than being aware and giving yourself the moral fortitude to understand that, to steal that line from the movie Good Will Hunting, it's not your fault, son. We have to change the system. That is going to require an educated populace that understands what's happening as compared to perceiving that is some random outcome that's tied to debasement of the dollar. Notice I didn't even talk about that, or tied to phenomena like the Federal Reserve setting interest rate policy. Again, I didn't talk about that, although I do think it has an impact in various ways. It really is the structure under which we're governing our society that is determining these outcomes. I don't want giant infrastructures set out to hand out checks to people to say, here's your money to spend on rent, and here's your money to spend on childcare, and here's your money to spend on food. I actually want to do the exact opposite, which is acknowledge that a system that is structured as we have it requires redistribution and investment that allows the individuals in our society that are building the next generation of taxpayers and workers, we call those children, right? That we are effectively allowing them to avoid bearing all of those costs with none of the benefits associated with it. And that does require significant redistribution. It requires those who are doing extraordinarily well in our society to understand that it is not a reflection of their skill. It is a reflection of the way we've structured the system in favor to them. That's a very hard thing to accept, right? When I tell my kids that they got their grades not because of their skill, but because the system inflates grades, they don't want to hear that message, right? Um, but it could be true. And so, the more you
Yeah, I
deny
mean,
reality, the worse off you end up being.
my natural, inclination is I don't trust the system to appropriately apportion the or redistribute the sort of resources. So, I would look at, New York or California and think, okay, they're raising taxes, and I just don't trust that they're actually going to put them in the right places.
I agree.
So, how do I think about that?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
that's why the solution set is actually to steal something from Milton Friedman, which is to say, you know what? Let's show these people the respect of just giving them the cash. Let them decide what to do with it. I don't need a giant infrastructure system. I just need effectively a negative tax rate for people who fall into a particular class. Getting married, having kids, right? And trying to produce the next taxpayers while simultaneously saving for your retirement. Man, that is a heavy nut to crack. How about I show you some respect and just give you a little bit more money? And by the way, earned income tax credit is not welfare, right? You cannot get it unless you are a participant in the system. So by offering it to people who are working, I'm actually subsidizing and encouraging participation in the labor force, right? It's a simple solution, but everybody hates it. Why? Because the right doesn't want to pay more taxes. And the left doesn't want to see the infrastructure that conveys their power base, as you see in places like California or Minnesota, dismantled.
Yeah.
But that's
No, that
the
makes
solution.
sense. That's very interesting. So, everybody's been listening or watching. Michael, you have a Substack, and it looks like you're number 12 in finance, that sounds pretty cool. So,
I always aspired to be number 12. That was my goal in life, is to come in 12th place. No, I mean, look, again, it is what it is. I want to convey to people very, very clearly, like, if you go to my Substack, first of all, I'm more than happy, just hit me in a direct message on Substack and say, hey, I'm below that $140,000 poverty line. Can I have access? I'm more than happy to give you access for free. If you can pay, it's very nice of you to subsidize other readers and the effort that I put into it, but it really is not a determinant of my lifestyle. And so I'm more interested in doing what I can by sharing information. It is going to be dense. It is going to be hard. I will do the best I possibly can to explain these very complex topics, but it is part of the process of self-education that says, no, the solution is not to go buy Bitcoin. No, the solution is not to, increase socialist redistributions and create giant edifices that hand out checks that tell you exactly here's how much money to spend on your rent. Those are all systems that destroy information. Those are systems that destroy capitalism, which again draws its value from the ability of the participants in the society to convey what they need and what they value through pricing information. Um, but if you're up for the ride, I'm more than happy to give it to you.
awesome. Well, I appreciate you taking the time here to share with us. This has been really informative, and I encourage everybody to check out Michael's Substack and continue getting educated on these topics.
Thank you very much, Jordan. I'm glad we could make this happen.